Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mila, you're on my book nook, and today I have sort of like an introduction and also kind of like a follow-up video, I guess, or like a redo video, like a updated version, so to speak, of my how I annotate video. So I've got a couple of examples. Not all of them are fully annotated. I think one is technically fully annotated, but I think the premise of what I'm going to talk about still stands for these, even if I didn't finish annotating them or if I didn't finish the book, but I plan to continue it at some point and then finish annotating it. Like my rules and sort of my tips and tricks that I go for and kind of my habits, I still kind of go about them, even with books that I've sort of put down and haven't gone back to since sort of putting them down. So I'll link the original video down below, but honestly, I'm just going to repeat kind of things that I've said and kind of add some more things. So take this as like an updated version of like the video, an update and a recap, so to speak. So just like a quick baseline, if you're new to the bookish world or bookish reading habits or stuff like that, annotating is when you have a book, whether it's an ebook or a physical one, whatever it may be, and you sort of put your pen down into it, put ink on it, so to speak. So you write down your thoughts, you circle, passages, you underline passages, you highlight passages, you tab certain things, you mark it basically and make it your own. So sort of when you go into a secondhand bookstore and you find notes in the margins, that is what annotating is basically. It is what annotating is, but I guess when you're buying a book with annotations, there's almost a different mindset to it rather than compared to like when it's your own book that you're annotating. So, so for example, I'll give you my first ever sort of properly annotated book that I have here, which is the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And this is an interesting one because this was my first proper foray, I think, into annotating. And this was also the first classic that I read that was for me. So no classes, no syllabus, no grading, nothing. And this was the classic that I chose. So nobody gave this to me. Nobody told me you should read it because y'all know I'm not going to listen. It's going to be a while until I listen. I'm not going to listen right away. So I bought this one. It's like one of those cheaper copies. I think it was 2 for $10, but I was like, I don't want to buy a second one. Like I don't need a second one. I just wanted to read this one. And I really like this edition. I find that the, cover is interesting. I'm very particular about like my classics covers. If you can't tell, I have quite a few editions of different classics. And as I said, this is the first one that I annotated properly for me without anyone sort of peering over my shoulder or grading me or anything. So yeah, for some people, annotating is a way to sort of have a conversation with the author and the characters and sort of dissect the meaning. For others, well, I mean, this for me kind of shows that I love my books, So for some people, it might be too much that my books aren't in pristine condition. But for me personally, first of all, I bought these books, a majority of them, with my own money. And second off, I can always buy a second copy. I can always buy another copy, especially classics. I can always buy another copy. So obviously to each their own, but if you do want to get into classics and I guess annotating as well, or to annotating and then get into classics, I think annotating while reading classic is the best way to truly understand the book. You can obviously read once for a pass-through, kind of absorb the story on like a surface level. But I think classics, it's one of those, I guess, genres of books, those types of books that they're worth looking a little bit deeper into. And there's plenty of guides on YouTube and on the internet in general as to how, to tackle like the big books. Even something like the Picture of Dorian Gray, there's so many intricacies to it and there's so many layers to it, even if it's so short. But I'd highly recommend, diving a little deeper into the classics. So yeah, so in the kind of annotating community, I feel like what's important is that annotators shouldn't look down on non-annotators and vice versa, because I feel like that's not conducive to anyone. Because if we don't share our opinions and sort of we don't have further conversations, then can we really move on kind of as a society. And as I mentioned earlier, people are almost contradictory in their mindset towards classics and their attitude towards, in their mindset towards annotations and their attitudes towards annotations, because a lot of people will say, especially readers, right? They will say, oh, I love when I find vintage copy, like a secondhand copy of a book, whatever it may be, especially like a classic, as I said, because a lot of classics, they have annotations. People annotate them for a reason. And they're like, oh, I really love it when I find notes and I find scribbles in the margins and I find, thoughts and circled portions of it, and maybe not highlights. I think highlights are a little, unless you have like a really nice highlighter, but I think a lot of highlighter colors are not very pleasant. But just let's stick to like pencil and pen markings, and notes in the margins and circling words and highlighting phrases and stuff like that. But then they don't do that for their own books, which is, I find interesting, because okay, you value annotated book when you're buying it, but you don't want to do that for yourself, which is totally fine. But then you look down on those that do it for their own books, which is what I think there's like that very thin line. You're standing on very thin ice, and it is very much starting to crack. So, as I said, obviously you do you, whatever you want. I don't think this copy of the Picture of Dorian Gray is worth any less than just a regular secondhand, non-annotated copy. And who knows, maybe someone in the future will read this and it will help them for an essay or something like that. And not gonna lie, I'm really proud of the notes. Like, they may be very baseline still, because I was so young when I read this. I don't remember how young I was, but probably 20 or something like that. I'm 24 now, so it's been a while since I read this. And if I were to reread it, I think I'd get another edition, because God knows I don't want to look at my thoughts. But it would be interesting to compare my thoughts in here versus my thoughts now in the book, and maybe what I've noticed then and what I didn't notice, and what I notice now versus, what I noticed back then, kind of the differences and similarities as well. And as for, I guess, the crux of this, in a sense, is why do I annotate? What does it give me? And as I said, especially the Picture of Dorian Gray, it gives me a slightly deeper understanding of the story. And I find it that I rarely go onto the internet to discover a lot more about the classics I read, at least. I tend to try to sort of focus on what I understand from the text and what I take from the text, and kind of my interaction with what the author is saying and the characters and sort of happenings in the plot and stuff like that. And, it's just, as someone who's also like a classicist and into classical studies, so ancient history, I think we're also taught to not be scared to really put your thoughts down and mark your thoughts, because I think that physical evidence is important, because we lost so much of it because of, loss of alphabet and the ability to read and write, especially like for something during like the Dark Ages, the Bronze Age collapse. We lost so much history because nobody read or wrote anything. So yeah. And as I said, so it also helps me when I'm making content. So I, for example, last year, I read The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandrian, and I annotated about, I want to say, 70% of it. And the reason why I didn't finish tabbing it is because I literally got tired of tabbing it, but I think I might have underlined a couple of things. I just wanted to, continue with the momentum that I had, just finish the story because it was getting very good. But because I annotated, there are more things that I remember personally about the book and how I felt during certain times. And one thing that I remember very distinctly is the amount of, I guess, comparisons and references to ancient times. So it's so good, and it really deepened my understanding of the story and my enjoyment as well. Obviously, just because you annotate doesn't mean that you're going to further enjoy a book, but it might just add to said enjoyment if you compared to if you're just reading the book on almost a surface level. So, and I guess you could take this as a very pro annotating video. But yeah, so this has definitely helped with content stuff. As I said, I explained to you basically what I enjoyed about the book in greater detail, I think, than I would have if I just read this just on its own without annotating it. Also, it's a chunker, and I felt like it would be a good idea, a better idea to annotate rather than not, because there's so much information packed into this, and the story behind this is also very interesting. So yeah, I would just, in general, highly recommend. Just, I guess, obviously do what makes you happy. And yeah, I guess one of the bigger questions people ask is, do I annotate every book I read? No. I think that was the same answer that I had when I first made this video, but no, I don't annotate every book that I read. I only annotate the books that I think I will have a lot of information to extract from, and a lot of, I guess you can put it as philosophical musings I can extract from, or information in general. So for example, as I said, I knew that I would have a lot of thoughts on The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is why I annotated it, because even though it's such a short book, Oscar Wilde is such a phenomenal writer for a reason, and this is such a popular classic, and it's also a very easy classic. So it gave me a little bit of a taste of what kind of reader I was when it comes to classics, which is one who annotates quite a bit. Same with The Count of Monte Cristo. As I said, I learned quite a bit about, I guess, the time period and also the writing and the inspiration of this book. I think it's very interesting. I'm very excited to also read this in French, which is going to be an interesting turn of events. Another book that I started annotating quite a bit was Babel by Kuang. This is actually my ARC copy, and I actually started annotating it. And the reason I started annotating it is because it's so academic, and because it references so many different things. So yeah, the reason why I sort of started annotating Babel, as I said, is because it's very academic, and I wanted to sort of experience, I guess, the academia that the characters experienced. And there's just a lot of information in this book. There's also footnotes in this book, which is also very interesting, something I don't really see in modern books, like books written in modern day. So yeah, that's another reason why I kind of annotate. And as I said, not every book gets annotated, but a majority is usually books some of it, you know, I think I would definitely, as I said, if I read Picture of Dorian Gray, I would definitely annotate it again. Another book that I annotated that I don't have at the moment, because I gave it to my cousin, who is the intended recipient, is Six of Crows. I think it was my third reread, and so we decided to sort of annotate our copies, and we would switch them. Although she finished her book, but she didn't finish annotating it, so she has both copies, I guess. So that's one kind of, I guess, listing of books that I annotate. Another is books I probably am going to talk about in depth to the camera, or in, for example, a Substack post. So also check that out. Definitely, there are a couple of books that I definitely want to dive further into when it comes to like reviews and videos and stuff like that. A majority of the books that I annotate are classics as well as nonfiction. So I guess another example would be the Odyssey. There's not a lot of tabs in this, but there are quite a few like annotations like in pen. I just don't like the, I guess, orange pen that I used in this, so I kind of stopped annotating it. But for example, my copy of the Emily Wilson translation, I did annotate quite a bit, so there's also that. And an example of, I guess, a nonfiction would be something like The Persians by Lloyd Welland-Jones. I also have actually the Cleopatras, which hasn't been severely annotated. I think I got through a lot more of The Persians than I did Cleopatras, but this one, again, a lot of information. I think it's just mainly to help me deal with, I guess, the information overload that especially nonfiction books have. This also depends on the way that it's written, if it's super academic, or if it's more for, I guess, a regular person, a regular reader who doesn't know a lot, or if it's for someone like me who's kind of in the middle, who knows a little bit but not a lot, enough to, I guess, make conversation. And again, also books that I know that I'll want to, you know, talk about and again make conversation and reread and stuff like that. One book that I am currently kind of going through slowly is Anna Karenina. I don't have a lot of tabs in it at the moment, having thing, which we'll talk about supplies in a second, but I do have, for example, just like some underlined, sorry, it's not focusing, underlined portions, so to speak. So obviously not super, deep into the book yet. I'm still, I think I'm 50 pages in, but it just helps sort of, again, with the information overload. I think that's one of the more important things. Stuff like fancy editions or special editions, or I guess books that I would consider gifts, I tend to not really annotate. If I do want to annotate, I'd usually take my Kindle and get a copy on there and annotate there, or take a separate notebook and just write notes and stuff like that. But again, annotating doesn't really ruin the book for me. In fact, for me, it just gains more value. So yeah. And, do you need to annotate in a scholarly manner? No. Sometimes even in the big series books like Anna Karenina, I am literally dissing the character that we're following because I just don't like this character, Or in something, as I said, a series is The Persians, right? It's a nonfiction book about this, culture that has, existed for such a long time, and it's this great empire and this great, group of empires and stuff like that, and leaders and everything. And sometimes I'm like, LOL. There are genuinely funny parts. I mean, it's also the way that the author writes the book, but there are genuinely just some funny parts that I'm like, LOL. Like, he says Persian version. Like, come on, right? And just to sort of go off from the classics point, like classical studies point, and going into like classics, whether it's ancient history or like, something from Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or something like that. A few things I didn't really cover the first time around is my viewpoint on translations. The reason why I have several copies of different classics, whether it's the Odyssey or something like Anna Karenina, or several copies of Master and Margarita. I have 2 copies, so, and that comes down to the translation, because I think the translation really makes or breaks your experience. And this is similar in the sense that an edition can make or break your experience. So for example, if I wanted to just read, let's go for this one, for example, right? I didn't think I was going to pull this out, but if I wanted to just read Pride and Prejudice without really going too deep into it and maybe annotating here or there, I would pick up something like a Penguin English Library edition, because this doesn't have introduction, this doesn't have notes, it's just the text, right? It's just a regular book, and I do have a couple of annotations in it because, again, it's such an interesting story that I wanted to dive a little deeper, and I wanted to put my, notes on the page, to put my thoughts on the page, and I guess mark my spot in a sense in this copy, so to speak. But if I wanted to, for example, as I said, dive a little deeper into a classic, and I know I'm going to want to dive deeper into a classic, I would definitely choose an edition like a Penguin Classics edition. And this is whether or not the original book is in English, right? So for example, for this, obviously, since it's translation, it's important. The translation is just as important, I think, as the edition, because the introduction, the biography, the indexes, the notes, it can really make or break your understanding of a book. Whereas, for something that would be considered a light read that you don't necessarily have to delve deeper into too much, and you can still, write some thoughts and kind of move on, then you would choose something like this, right? Something simple, or it's just a book. So, as I said, another example would be this copy of Jane Eyre that I have. I'm going to be annotating this, but I think I am pretty, experienced enough with classics that I don't really need to delve super duper deep as I would, for example, in Anna Karenina, because Tolstoy is something else. He's on another level. Not saying that Bronte, Charlotte Bronte isn't on another level, because, one of them certainly is, but is Wuthering Heights by Charlotte Bronte? I'm just trying to remember now. Whoops. But yeah, I did not enjoy Wuthering Heights. I'm just hoping that I will enjoy this one more. My mom really wants me to read it, so I got myself a nice, simple edition. They didn't have, unfortunately, Penguin Classics versions at the bookstore that I was at, and I didn't want to spend so much money. This was like $8. Not even. This was, I guess there was a sticker on it. That's why there's no, information inside as for the price. So, as I said, again, translation makes or breaks it. The, I guess the edition also makes or breaks it. And this is why I have like so many translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad, because I think I tend to pull different things from different translations. And I think that's important when you're delving into something as old and as complex as a Homeric epic, you know. And again, translation makes or breaks your experience, definitely. Another thing that I kind of do, I guess, in a sense, is read fiction and nonfiction kind of in tandem. So for example, it doesn't have to be like super direct, right? It doesn't have to be the Iliad and specifically a book on the Iliad. It can be the Iliad and specifically a book on, yes, the Greek hero, right? So for example, The Greek Hero in 24 Hours, I believe it's called, by Gregory Nagy, might be a good comparison. Or if you do want to dive deeper into the Iliad and the relationship between the supposed author Homer and the Iliad, and I guess stuff like that, you could pair the Iliad, right, which is a quite a lengthy book, with, for example, something like Homer and his Iliad by Robin Lane Fox, which is a nonfiction, and it's rather short, at least my copy is. So that could be a good sort of like, if you get a little tired of the Iliad, you can switch to the nonfiction. It kind of wakes up your brain. You can kind of, I guess, intercept the different happenings and stuff like that. Or, for example, if you're reading the Persians, right, and he mentions the Shahnameh, which is the Persian Book of Kings, you can start reading, maybe not the full volume, because that's quite lengthy, but you can read something like the Tragedy of Sohrab and Rustam, which is specifically one of the most famous stories of the Shahnameh, and this is just like a side-by-side kind of option. So there's like, you know, it's good to sort of, I guess, change things, and again, you can enhance the experience of reading as well as annotating, going a little bit deeper, you know, while still grounding yourself, while still having both feet in like fiction and nonfiction worlds. I hope that makes sense. So as for supplies, I guess this is something that people are definitely waiting for. My pencil case is downstairs, unfortunately, but I guess we'll start with tabs. I have so many of them, courtesy of my boyfriend at some point. So I do have these square post-its. Hold on, it's not, sorry guys. It literally is not focusing. There we go. There are these, you know, post-its, and it's giving dark academia, and I really like them. So there's post-its, and I just have a bunch of these tabs. And these ones are not my favorite. I definitely like the ones with the little white ends at the end. Let me see if I can find an example, so to speak. Here's an example. So, because they're, I guess, clearer to annotate, I guess, and it just feels a little more aesthetic. I think that's kind of it. I have so many of these because my boyfriend got me a bunch of them at some point, so, which was very nice of him. As for like writing supplies, sometimes it's literally a mechanical pencil. As I said, my pencil case is downstairs, so I can't really grab you anything specific. It's literally like a Muji pencil case. I do have like a purple pen. This is a purple Muji pen. It's in the 0.38 nib. There we go. You see that? I hope you can see that. So these are my preferred nibs. I definitely like the 0.38 more than anything else. And I've sort of almost exclusively switched to 0.38 pens, so to speak, when it comes to writing, when it comes to annotating, stuff like that. So I rarely use a pencil and stuff like that, but it's definitely much easier for me to process my thoughts in pen, I guess. And sometimes I use different colors. Most of the time it's either a black pen, black Muji pen, or a black blue pen that I really like. I like the black blue colors as well. Or like this dark sort of burgundy red color that I really like. That's definitely one thing. I do use a ruler sometimes. Sometimes I use like sticky tab thingies as a ruler. Sometimes I use an actual ruler, kind of depends. Again, I don't use highlighters because I find that every type of highlighter, maybe it's just a me thing, so like I just have rotten luck with highlighters or something like that. But I don't use highlighters because even if people swear up and down their highlighters don't bleed, somehow the highlighters will bleed for me. They will bleed through the next page. They will bleed on the page. Like it's ridiculous. As for, I guess, my annotating system, I should have gotten to that earlier. I don't really have one. I kind of, I don't really have an annotating system per se, because I feel like if I, for example, whoopsies, I feel like if I, for example, say, okay, the pink is this and the green is this and the blue is this, I feel like if I, assign sort of themes and stuff, A, it's not going to look as cohesive, I guess, and B, I'm going to run out of the specific tabs very quickly. So instead, what I do is I kind of just like go down the line. And what it makes is actually a very nice, I guess, ombre, which you can kind of see here in a sense. Again, I don't have my copy of Six of Crows. It's a nicer image, I guess. I'll try to put a picture of it post in editing. But yeah, you kind of go down the line and just tab whatever the heck you're interested in, and it kind of goes, I guess, light to dark to kind of light again, which is a nice, I guess, ombre effect. I don't really have a system. If I do want, a system, I would probably use like a separate notebook for specific moments and just like, write down the quote or write down the page or whatever and write my thoughts on it, and I guess mark it somehow in the book, Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I tab sort of thoughts, feelings, favorite moments, quotes I like, and stuff like that. Maybe I'll give you an example from here, I guess. Yet life had decided that for him, life and his own infinite curiosity about life, eternal youth, infinite passion, pleasures subtle and secret, wild joys and wilder sins, he was to have all these things. The portrait was to bear the burden of his shame. That was all. A feeling of pain crept over him as he thought of the desecration that was in store for the fair face on the canvas. Once, in boyish mockery of Narcissus, he had kissed, or feigned to kiss, those painted lips that now smiled so cruelly at him. Morning after morning, he had sat before the portrait, wondering at its beauty, almost enamored of it, as it seemed to him at times. Was it to alter now with every mood to which he yielded? Was it to become a monstrous and loathsome thing, to be hidden away in a locked room, to be shut out from the sunlight that had so often touched to brighter gold the waving wonder of its hair? The pity of it. The pity of it. So just like, some, I guess, thoughts and stuff like that. And just a lot of references, obviously, to Shakespeare and the ancient world, so to speak. There's like an Achilles statue mentioned, memory, wisdom, love, death as like actual people, personified, so to speak. Romeo, Mercutio, Juliet, Greek, just all these references that I underline. So that's, I guess, a taste of what I sort of underline and stuff like that. So yeah. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's definitely a long one and a little all over the place, I guess, but I hope you enjoyed regardless, and I hope that this might have helped a little bit in your annotation journey. Let me know if you have any questions. Follow me on my Instagram as well. If you have any questions, send me a DM. Follow my Substack, and I might, have a longer, more in-depth post about it, I guess, as long as I could, I guess, because Substack does have limitations. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know your annotation systems, I guess, and how you kind of go about it. And as usual, I will see you in the next one. And as usual, happy reading.